audio now, and I'll say hi, everybody. My name is Jack Packard.
I'm Darren Mooney.
And this week on the Escapist Movie Podcast, we have a cavalcade of topics. First, we're going to start off with a little announcement about a change of formats. Then we are going to talk about Spy Kids, the little movie that is a kind of a big deal in Hollywood, I feel. Robert Rodriguez is remaking it. Then we are going to talk about Raya and the Last Dragon. No, I didn't say The Last Jedi, and so I think that's points for me. Raya and the Last Dragon, which we got some interesting news about from Disney. And finally, I have finally convinced someone to talk about The Expanse with me, because I'm a huge fan of The Expanse, and no one else will talk about it with me. Thank you, Darren.
It's what I'm here for, literally. It's in my contract.
You got a contract? Wow, that's exciting. So hi and welcome, Internet, everyone. This is the Escapist Movie Podcast. I think for the new thing we're going to do, I'm actually going to make like a little stinger that I can play when we're live, because that's the first announcement. The first announcement is that we are changing formats slightly. Obviously, it will still be Darren, myself, and occasional guests here or there, but we are no longer going to record our podcast. We are going to live stream all of these wonderful discussions right here on the Escapist Movie channels. Monday, we're still locking down a time, but it'll be Monday, at least here in the States, Monday afternoon.
Yeah, probably Monday evening from my perspective. For the massive European audience that we have, like wearing berets, smoking cigarettes, and existing in black and white, watching a movie podcast. That's what I imagine our European audiences are like.
Always coming home with a baguette in a bag
and a bundle of garlic.
That's all you eat over there in Europe.
I'm European. I'm allowed to say this stuff, Jack.
But is it
I'm still in the EU. I'm still allowed to say this stuff.
Well, for now, we'll see how that ends up, because that never-ending drama. But yeah, it's exciting. It'll be a live stream conversation, obviously. We're excited about it because you listeners, watchers, can take part in that conversation. We will have our bevy of topics, some light movie reviews, some topics here or there, and you can now take part in them. Of course, all of them will be archived if you want to listen to them later. But that's the big announcement, and it's pretty darn exciting, as I am a fan of live streaming in general.
I've live streamed before once, but that was an 18-hour live podcast covering Twin Peaks: The Return for charity. I feel like it's not indicative of how live streaming is supposed to work. So, this is a new horizon for me. I am enchanted and terrified, but I trust Jack and I trust our listeners, so I'm looking forward to it.
That is beautiful. So now we will get right to the discussions. First and foremost, Robert Rodriguez is an interesting filmmaker.
I don't think that's a debatable statement. I think that's just a statement of fact. He is a very interesting filmmaker.
He is a very interesting filmmaker. I remember back before Desperado came out, I was shown this weirdo little no-budget action movie called El Mariachi, and it blew my little mind. I'll tell you what. Then, of course, Desperado comes out and his bevy of fine films, which then morphed into basically Robert Rodriguez making his own studio outside of the Hollywood system. I want to say he's over in Texas.
Yeah, he's an Austin filmmaker. He's one of that generation of filmmakers, I believe, including people like, say, Richard Linklater, for example. Will be one of those, yeah.
Yeah, and so basically he just built his own little production studio over in Texas, mostly green screen enabled, and makes literally whatever movie he feels like making. He's living like the auteur dream.
He is, but I think what I really, really admire about Rodriguez is that you say the auteur dream and it conjures up images of, again, that kind of like person wearing a beret, smoking a cigarette, talking about how human existence is nothing but suffering and film exists as sculpting in time and all this sort of stuff that you write big treatises about. what I admire about Rodriguez, and I say this as somebody who thinks that, his films in general, some of them are great, some of them are grand, some of them are less great. But I do admire the fact that he makes whatever he wants, and more than that, he makes projects seemingly with collaborators that he enjoys working with. The point where like a large amount of his output seems to exist purely because his kids like movies. He likes spending time with his kids. He also likes movies. Let's make movies together. And it's the kind of thing that you would normally go, that's very indulgent or very cynical or very calculated. I mean, there are countless examples of stars and kind of like famous celebrities trying to turn their relatives into stars or celebrities through nepotism. But that's not what it feels like Rodriguez is doing. When you watch these movies, it feels like Rodriguez is just making a home movie, but he's making it to the standards of a guy who has a studio in Texas, which I kind of adore.
Well, no, and also on the forefront of, for better or for worse, as we're talking about Spy Kids here, he's on the forefront of kind of digital filmmaking and using effects heavy film, very green screen heavy filmmaking. So you don't need the studio lot. You just need a green wall and a camera, and guess what? We'll fill it out later.
Yeah, you don't even need the actors to all be present at the same time in terms of scheduling. You can work that out later as well. I like what I really like about Rodriguez is the fact that it's that indie aesthetic, that movement that kind of emerged in the early 90s. And again, you point to auteurs, you point to people like, say, Linklater, you point to people like Tarantino, which obviously Rodriguez has a very long kind of relationship with. But Rodriguez seems to take a lot of what you associate with that early 90s filmmaking, which is filmmaking on the go, filmmaking on the cheap, guerrilla filmmaking. Yes. And has actually managed to scale that upwards. So you look at things like, you look at Quentin Tarantino's body of work, and his movies as he's gotten older and bigger have become more studio kind of pictures. They become like grand old westerns with huge casts, large budgets, awards fair up the yin yang. But then you look at what Rodriguez is doing, and he's scaled up comparably, but he's still kept doing the same thing, where it's, you look at it, it's like, well, who's available for a day to shoot this scene? Stick him in front of a green screen. That's it. Thank you for your time. Really enjoyed working with you. Let's make another one of these 3 or 4 years later. You like my kids, right? My kids like you. Let's put you in the movie.
Right. Well, and that like run and gun aesthetic of just knowing, like, listen, we're going to use green screen. It's not going to look real. It might not even look great, but the idea is on the screen. That's all that matters. And we're doing it in budget. Yes. So you have to respect that.
Yeah, he's like that guy who's, was it the Funny or Die thing that was like imagining Nicolas Cage's agent? And when they're pitching ideas to Nicolas Cage just keeps saying
yes.
yes.
That was a college, as someone who is a former Funny or Die employee, I have to say that I believe that was College Humor, our rival. So.
Okay, apologies for bringing up that old trauma. But like the moment I keep thinking about, when I think about Rodriguez, I think about that moment from that sketch where Gary, his agent, is like, "Why are you doing this, Nick?" And Nick's response is, "I just like making movies, Gary." And I kind of like, you look at Rodriguez and you look at his filmography where he makes like a lot of stuff in a year. You're like, the reason that he does this is because he loves doing it, and I can't hate that. Even if I don't think all the stuff is fantastic, I kind of admire the fact that it's a kid playing with toys that he adores playing with.
Absolutely. And, like the original Spy Kids, all of the original Spy Kids aren't, like if we're going to just be like as objective as we can, they're not the best movies. They're not the most well-constructed pieces of film. But here's what I will say. As someone who has children, who has watched these movies with their children, everyone had a good time. There's giant thumb monsters. That's all you need. It's weird, actually.
Yeah. Alan Cumming hamming it up several notches, as Alan Cumming is wont to do when you unleash him on a project. I mean, like this is the thing that I find kind of interesting. And again, this is one of the things where it's that you mentioned, like looking at things objectively and being like, this is not necessarily good filmmaking. And you look at some of his other projects, The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl, for example, or the recent We Need Heroes, or you can be a hero, or We're All Heroes.
Oh, yeah.
the one that was on Netflix, basically, We Can Be Heroes, apologies, starring like Boyd Kirkland and various other people who owe Rodriguez a favor and clearly enjoy his company. And you look at, say, the internet's reaction to those, and like you look at things like, say, the IMDb rating, where like The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl is on the bottom 100 movies ever made, and it's like I know it's not a good movie, but it's a movie that he put together with a bunch of kids. Like, I feel like, you're grading on a curve here. I don't think anybody's going to accidentally enter The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl into the Oscars or the Cannes Grand Prix. But I feel like going online and giving it a 1 on IMDb feels a bit aggressive for dealing with like what is clearly a labor of love. Perhaps a misguided labor of love. Perhaps not the perfect labor of love. Perhaps not, a good film of itself. It still feels incredibly malicious to have that be one of the worst movies ever made. I would argue that he's made worse movies that are like better made.
I think, I mean, listen, he made Alita Battle Angel. Like, there are worse, bigger budget movies that he has made. Absolutely.
Hey. I will not hear anything bad said against Edward Norton as James Cameron. Thank you very much. Do not pick that up. Alita Battle Angel is not a good movie, to be absolutely clear. I'm not saying that it is. It's a messy, clumsy movie. I think it's like 3 or 4 different movies crammed together from what I recall watching it. Several of its plot developments make no sense whatsoever and operate completely independently of any sense of stakes or how they relate to one another. But what I do remember quite liking about it is that it stars Mahershala Ali, right? And he's like, again, twice Oscar-winning actor. One of the greatest actors of his generation. One of the guys where you're like, what the hell is he doing here?
Yeah.
But one of the things that I admire is that, like, repeatedly through the film, he is taken over. And again, mild spoilers coming up here for Alita Battle Angel. But he is... not that we've encouraged our listeners to go and, like, line it up on their Netflix or their kind of, like, Amazon Prime or wherever it is. But, like, throughout the film, Mahershala Ali plays a character who is bodyjacked by another person, and that other person is a sinister force who is controlling and manipulating events, and very obviously being set up for the sequel. And it's very clear that, they've hired an actor, they know who the actor is, and I love that Mahershala Ali's performance is so good that when I was watching it, it's like, is he doing an Edward Norton impression? And then you get to the end, and the reveal of the guy who's been bodyjacking him is Edward Norton as James Cameron, inexplicably.
I guess what I will give that movie is, yes, a lot of very good performances in the worst story ever told. It's just very, very bad it's very, very messy. It's a mess. But that's the point. Like, the point is, like, Robert Rodriguez knows what kind of films he makes, and he makes them down and dirty. For myself, I am a behind the camera person. I am a shooter. My time at Funny or Die, as we talked about, that's what we did. We ran around with a camera, got whatever the hell footage we could, and made it work later. So, like, there's always this respect with Robert Rodriguez and his Spy Kids movies. Even though they're like schlocky family adventures, they're goofy, they're corny, they're still his movies. Like, they're not, it's not him like making a studio movie. He still made that in his garage the way he wanted to make it. He just wanted to make a goofy action family movie, right?
Yeah. And there are far, far, far too few filmmakers who get to do that these days. Because you look at things like, even we talked about this, I think, before, with the directors who sign up for Marvel. And they're told, no, we'll handle the action scenes. Or we have a team that do the special effects. Or we have a stunt team, and they're the guys who do this. And I kind of do have a huge respect for a director who's like, no. I'm going to take the footage to my garage, and I'm going to take a little knife and a little scissors, and chop it up together. Have my own little home PC here going. We'll see how it works when it comes out the other end.
I'm going to shoot it. I'm going to build the sets. I'm going to be behind the camera, and I'm going to edit it, because that's all the things that I like doing. Yeah. And so, like, we're getting a newer Spy Kids, a reboot of Spy Kids. I believe it's a reboot, right? Not like a
continuation. not like I believe it's a reboot. Again, it's
Yeah.
very early days. It's just I think Skydance Pictures basically have said that, and it's going to be Rodriguez writing and directing as
Mm.
well. And it's been described as a reimagining, which is one of those words
Oh.
where you get the sense that they haven't decided what it is. Where it's like, is it going to be a reboot? Is it going to be a legacy sequel? It's like, just call it a reimagining, a reworking, a reconceptualization. All the re-words that are not reboots. But yeah, it's kind of, it is interesting. And again, this is one of the things where, again, this is we're plumbing the depths of the intellectual property mine, where it's like, yes, I don't have any big problem with Spy Kids. Like yourself, I think they are intensely charming, and I think that there is a kind of a goofy charm for them, despite the fact they're not necessarily good films. But it's like, do I need a reimagining of this? Is this, do I need a franchise? Do I need a cross-generational Spy Kids? Do I need like you grew up and you saw Spy Kids as a kid, now take your kids to see Spy Kids? Like, do I need Spy Kids to be that?
But it's not that old of a property, right? Because like I'm just looking up at
well,
Spy Kids now.
2001, right? So this is 20 years ago now to make us all feel old.
Right, and so it's like that generation might not have kids old enough to enjoy it yet. It would be my generation where I was way too old to watch Spy Kids when it first came out because I was like starting college then. And so it's like it's this weird thing where it's like you're absolutely right. Like we're just scraping the barrel for IP, and it's like, well, we've used all the 80s and 90s IP. We got to go to the aughts now. We're getting a Matrix sequel. We're getting a Spy Kids reimagining.
Yeah,
This is the world.
I remember, like, I'm old enough, and again, this is one of the things where I'm old enough to remember when they were doing the 80s wave of nostalgia and kind of laughing with my friends and being like, can you imagine when they get to the 90s nostalgia? What's that going to be like? What are they going to nostalgize from the 90s? It's like, oh yeah, X-Files reboot coming right up. Okay, fine. Fair point. I'll give you that. Will and Grace reunion. What? I don't... Do I want that? Friends reunion on HBO Max. Why? Why is this happening? Make it stop, please.
Because that's the new law. The new law is the new gold rush is intellectual property. It's the strange thing for me is that Rodriguez is doing it because again, he's a filmmaker that does whatever he wants. So it's like, we actually didn't we recently get a new Shark Boy and Lava Girl? Or that how long ago was that? Let's see here. Yeah, I'm looking.
I don't believe so. Although keep in mind he's made so much that it's entirely possible it's kind of snuck through. Did they not get crossed over into one of the Spy Kids, if I remember correctly? There was some sort of weird cross-universe pollination going on.
Oh yeah, maybe that's what I'm thinking of.
Oh, but hey, Spy Kids 4D is actually on the bottom 100 as well, which just seems mean to me.
Come on.
It does just seem a little mean, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Understand the movie that you're putting on your list, I guess. But it's weird for me because, it's weird for me because we are now being nostalgic for properties that are from the year 2000. We are being nostalgic from a writer-director who has never, and I guess he's tapped into the idea of nostalgia. Like if you look at his Machete
Grindhouse,
or his Grindhouse collaboration with Quentin Tarantino, but he's never ate his own tail. He's never been the snake that ate his own tail like he is doing currently. So,
yeah. No, it's kind of disheartening. I mean, again, I do like that it's Rodriguez doing it because again, it means that the outcome will be Rodriguezian, as it were, in that it will be recognizably of a piece with the others. So, because the worst case is oh no, Skydance have optioned it, and Ron Howard. Ron Howard is your surprise Spy Kids director, and I'm sure it'll be grand. Again, we talked in the podcast before about how Ron Howard is generally competent. And it's I feel like if you're doing Spy Kids and it's generally competent, you're betraying the premise. It's it should be kids playing. It should be home video, home movie quality, but you manage to convince your mates going. It's your dad's filming you playing around and goofing, but he's also very good with special effects, has written a couple of scripts, and is best buddies with Quentin Tarantino. So that's all going to be in there as well. And I feel so I mean, again, it's kind of, it's a mixed bag. It's I'm not against the idea of Rodriguez going back to this stuff because I know that even if he does, it's only going to be one of 5 different projects that he does in a year. It'll be he'll do that, he'll do a bunch of music videos, he'll direct a handful of TV episodes, and he'll do something else with Danny Trejo. And you're yeah, sure, I'm sure one of these would be good statistically speaking.
Absolutely.
And it will be done in his style, which is probably better than the alternative, which is, well, we focus group tested it, and it turns out J.J. Abrams' Spy Kids is opening on the July 4th weekend.
Oh no.
I don't.
Well, I suppose like it actually reminds me because you mentioned earlier your last live stream for Twin Peaks: The Return, and it was a lot of very similar sentiments to it. It's like, well, wait, do we need a Twin Peaks reboot? But wait, David Lynch does whatever he wants. Yeah, let him do whatever he wants.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
I do love that this is the
particular
only
cup
point of
tea.
comparison where we're actually like saying Spy Kids, Twin Peaks, basically the same thing, right?
I'm gonna say same side of the same curve, right? Like it's two writer directors who do whatever the hell they want, just in slightly different genres.
Yeah. That's fair. Waiting for Robert Rodriguez to start opening his YouTube channel and reading the weather.
Wouldn't that be great?
It would be great.
Although Robert Rodriguez would love for you to watch his movies on your fucking iPhone.
He seems like he'd be cool with that.
He'd be cool with that. Like, watch him on wherever you want. He doesn't care.
Again, and again, this is one of the things where Rodriguez, like, again, I have a huge soft spot for him. It's like convincing Tarantino, who is turned into the cranky old man. I love that he went from like enfant terrible to like the crankiest old man shaking his fist at the sky, and there was no in between phase. There was no phase where Quentin Tarantino was just like mellow in his middle age. Kind of like got in the car, went to work, and that was him for the day. But I kind of love that like Rodriguez managed to convince Tarantino to shoot on digital. That sequence in Sin City, it's the sequence where I think Clive Owen is the corpse talking in the car, and like knowing how Tarantino is. Oh no, it's Benicio del Toro and Clive Owen. Apologies, but Benicio del Toro is the guy with his throat cut. It's a fantastic sequence, but I love that like despite the fact Tarantino is like digital is dead. Cinema is the future. I'm only ever going to shoot on film. Rodriguez was kind of cool enough to say, come on, just try it, Quentin. Just try it. You don't have to like it. You don't have to make a whole movie. Just shoot a scene. Come on, give it a go. And like, I love that he was able to get Tarantino to go, fine. And Tarantino at the end kind of grudgingly goes, well, like Sin City, it worked for there, but I'm never doing it myself.
I'll go beneath myself for my friends every once in a while.
Yeah. I'll try this new thing. It's like when your buddy takes you out to like a restaurant and it's like, try this. You're like, I don't want to, but I feel like I have to because otherwise it's going to be awkward.
Absolutely. So there is your Spy Kids update. That's all we got. We are now moving on to Raya and the Last Dragon, which, much to the shock and awe of a lot of people, is going to Disney Plus, but going to Disney Plus Premium, similar to the way they rolled out Mulan, which is a one-time fee to have the ability to stream it via Disney Plus. Mulan had, we'll say, mixed results.
Yeah, again, this is one of the things where nobody actually knows what any of this means because nobody publishes any data. But if you look at tracking, for example, and you compare the impact in social media, you compare the Nielsen's, again, best guesstimates based on what they're putting together from data. If you look at, say, social media trackers, generally speaking, the consensus is that Disney did very, very well with Hamilton around the middle of last year. I think that was May or June, around that time last year, where they saw a huge spike in subscriptions and huge number of people watching. And if you were on the internet, it was impossible to avoid Hamilton. Not that it was easy before, but like for those 2 weeks, it was like, you are watching Hamilton, even if you don't have a Disney Plus subscription, because there's so much content. And then obviously at Christmas, there was Soul. And again, Soul seemed to create an earthquake that was felt, halfway around the globe in terms of impact. It was the big event. It was the most watched kind of like streaming service film. It was absolutely gigantic. And then on the other hand, you have Mulan, and you see various competing reports about how well it did, how poorly it did, how much money it raked in, whether it raked in somewhere close to $30 million, which would be ridiculously small, or somewhere up to maybe the top estimates I saw were about $200 million, which is pretty decent, but still not enough to earn back its budget in terms of that Premier Access. And it also didn't see a corresponding spike in memberships or subscriptions for Disney Plus, particularly when you compare it to something like, say, The Mandalorian or like the two movies that we mentioned there. So the general consensus is, and again, acknowledging this is all hoodoo, voodoo, nobody has any idea what any of this actually means.
Just pulling stuff right out of the air.
It's a fugazi, it's a woods, etc. But general consensus is from anybody who was paying any attention, and crucially from the fact that like Disney didn't try it again immediately with any of their big successful films. The understanding was that this didn't work, or that this didn't work to the extent that Disney wanted it to work, which is why it's interesting that they are doing it with Raya and the Last Dragon, because they're not doing it with another big live action blockbuster. They are not doing it with an existing property like Star Wars or like Marvel. And that's very interesting to me, because you would assume with those properties you have a built-in audience. You have fear of missing out. You have this idea of spoiler phobia that exists with a shared universe, where it's like, if you don't watch it on the day it's released, you're going to have it spoiled for you, and that will be worse. That will be like you never watched it at all, and man, wouldn't that be terrible? So you have to pay and fork over the money and watch it. And part of me is like, the fact that they're not doing that model with something like Black Widow, the fact that they're doing it with Raya and the Last Dragon is interesting to me. And if we're being charitable, what we might say is that they understand that they have parents by the feet and are dangling them upside down to see what falls out. Because if you look at the films that actually performed well on streaming services during the pandemic, films that actually sold well digitally, you're looking at films like, say, Trolls World Tour, which apparently outperformed the original Trolls just based on digital subscription, which is remarkable. And that sort of stuff. Like, you're looking at things like Artemis Fowl apparently did okay despite being terrible by any
Artemis Fowl, right?
Yeah. You're looking at, say, Scoob, which was released and apparently did reasonably well financially despite also being terrible. But you have this idea that like parents are so desperate for content to feed their kids that Disney realized they have a captive audience, and that if you are
literal captive audience, yes, we are all trapped in here with them, and they need stuff to watch.
Yeah, and like Raya and the Last Dragon seems like a very desperate attempt to extract money, because it's like, hey, you want to entertain your kids? We want you to entertain your kids. Be a real shame if your kids weren't entertained. That's what I'm saying. And like, if you're being charitable, that's what you'd say. And you'd say, okay, Disney have crunched the numbers and they figured out that's the most viable way of wringing money out of this. If you were being more cynical, you would make the point that Raya is not tied to an existing franchise. And Raya is also, unlike Soul or Hamilton at the time, not considered a major awards contender, because Hamilton was an awards contender until it was decided that it was not. And that was after it was released. Right. So, therefore, it doesn't matter if Raya and the Last Dragon flops. It will have no impact on the brand going forward. There'll be no damage to the equivalent of a Star Wars or an MCU. So this is an acceptable petri dish for us to try this again with. Because if it fails, nobody will care that much about it. And that is kind of when I'm looking at it and going, yeah, this feels a little cynical, doesn't it?
It does, though. That being said, it is a great data point, because I know a lot of the talk around Mulan's failure was the fact that no one really wanted more Mulan, especially overseas, which was like, that was the 4th Mulan movie released that year.
Yeah. In China, yeah.
Yes. And so like, just as a data point to say, one, it's animated, family friendly, people are going to like it. 2, it's a new property, not tied to anything. Let's throw this into the mix and see where it lands on our charts. Like, yes, as a data point, that's fantastic. As someone who is a Disney Plus subscriber and a consumer, I want to call absolute bullshit that I have to pay extra money on top of my money. Though as a family of 4, it's still less money than going to the theaters, which is a very similar thing I said with Mulan. So it's, it's like a big wibbly wobbly mess.
Yeah, no, it is. I mean, like, I'm really looking forward to it, because I feel like one of the things that, like, and particularly on this podcast, and particularly on Nerd Culture, and particularly on Twitter, particularly on YouTube, when we talk about Disney, we talk about the big brands. We talk about Star Wars, we talk about Marvel, we talk to a lesser extent about Pixar when it comes to the animated stuff. I really think that Disney have kind of killed it over the past decade with their princess movies. They're like animated princess movies. I think that, like, if you look at their animated films, particularly around the turn of the millennium, so things like, say, Treasure Planet, for example, or Atlantis, The Lost Empire, or even if you want to go computer-generated stuff like, say, Dinosaur, there's a real sense that, like, they kind of lost their way. And, like, that was around the time that Pixar arrived, and we were all like, Disney are so passé, the future is all Pixar. And Disney were like, okay, fine, we'll see your point. We now own Pixar. But what
Yeah.
what I admire is that like around about 2010, starting with the release of, I would argue, The Princess and the Frog creatively, but
Mm,
commercially starting with Tangled, the next
mm,
film
mhm.
on the list. You got this sense of like resurgent reinvention of their old-fashioned animation, their what you would
Mm.
call their princess movies. Because I would
Yeah.
argue, like looking back over the Disney princess movie canon, I would argue that you would be hard pressed to find a run as strong as The Princess and the Frog, followed by Tangled, followed by Frozen, followed by Moana, followed by, yes, even Frozen 2. And
Mhm.
so I look at Raya and the Last Dragon and I'm really excited about it because it's the kind of movie that Disney have been very quietly, very subtly, and very unshowily been making very well for about 10 years or so. And
Mm.
it's like, yeah, I'm excited about this. And it's weird that so few other people seem to be.
Hmm. Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to it. I know as someone who enjoys family movies, who enjoys Disney princess movies, yes, both Frozen's. Frozen 1 has a better story. Frozen 2 has better songs. That's just my opinion.
Frozen
I
2 very smartly gets rid of half its cast by sending them into the woods for like an hour in the middle, which I admire. Like, in terms of like writing room solutions, I admire that it's like, we have nothing to do with these characters. What are we going to do? Have them sing a song about getting lost in the woods and have them get lost in the
boom.
woods.
Yeah, no, and Into the Unknown is a much better song than Let It Go, and that's just the truth. That's just the truth coming out through me, and I am sorry, but I'm also not sorry. So I'm excited for Rhea. As someone who's maybe even a little more cynical as far as like new IP and the overseas market, specifically China,
Yeah.
charging for this new IP that I believe it's a realm known as Kumandra. Oh, okay, so it's a reimagined Earth.
Yeah.
It has at least on a surface level that kind of Dynasty Warriors fantasy element to it. So
Yes.
I can see this doing very well in the Chinese market.
Well, it is interesting. Like, China doesn't tend to necessarily like westernized depictions of itself, and
Mm,
understandably so.
mhm.
Again, I speak as an Irish person who looks at American depictions of Irish culture and is always like, "Well, that's certainly an interesting choice you made there." But I do wonder if I kind of wonder if that's maybe the opposite, because I mean, I think that Chinese audiences tend to turn out actually for non-mystical kind of Western shows about Western stories and films
Hmm,
about like family values. Like, if you look, say, Soul performed remarkably well over there, which nobody
sure.
would have anticipated. And again, one of the like common repeated box office lies that you hear about China is they don't like movies with like minority leads, and you're like, Soul was the first like entirely African American Pixar film, and it performed remarkably well over there. And I kind
Absolutely.
of wonder if almost the opposite of that, if they've crunched the numbers and done the math, and they're like, well, Raya's probably going to be a lost cause in China again after Mulan.
Oh,
That's what I
maybe.
kind of wonder, because it and again, like, you look at things and there are already people online, and I'm not an expert in this. I am not presenting myself as an expert in this, to be clear. But you're seeing discussions about its adoption of East Asian versus Southeast Asian cultures, heritage, and
Sure,
stuff like
sure.
that, and it gets kind of thorny. And it's like, I feel like if we're having these conversations in the Western world about that, in like Ireland, the UK, and the US, I imagine in actually like Southeast Asia and East Asia, there's probably a lot of people going, this is a little awkward. This is like,
Is it?
this is kind of like, if you were making a movie set in England and a guy showed up with a clove of garlic and a baguette tucked under his arm, you'd be like, yeah, this is probably a little
Wait,
bit, yeah.
wait a minute. You didn't quite get that right. Ooh, that's a good. I think that's a really fair point. That well, and of course, that's just my particular perspective from being, mostly dumb, but mostly an American. Right.
I'm also mostly dumb. I'm just not American. It's we're mostly dumb all over the world. I like this. It's an international flavor.
It's an it's an
The
international
flavor of
flavor of dumb.
dumbness.
Right. And so it's like the movie's going to come out. It's going to come out in premiere. There's probably going to be a smattering of talks about it. Does does this hurt Disney Plus as a brand that they keep experimenting like this, and if their experiments keep failing? Like Mulan, like we can beat around the bush, but Mulan overall was a failure, mostly because literally no one is talking about it anymore.
Yeah. But I mean, but you imagine that the things that people were talking about it were not what Disney wanted to be talking about it, which
Exactly.
is kind of amazing. Because, like, again, you look at the release of Mulan, and it's, again, these are big, serious, important things that merit discussion. But part of you is also like, this is very much boomerang laser guided karma, where you have Disney making a movie that is designed to appeal to the Chinese censors, not the Chinese people, to be clear. Need to be very clear on that,
Mm-hmm.
but to the Chinese state censors, in the hope of getting access to the Chinese market and securing access to that Chinese market for their future films. And they do all sorts of things that are highly questionable, including where they shoot, and what they put in the film, with regards
Mm-hmm.
to getting past the censors. And again, not the Chinese people, the Chinese censors, the Chinese government. And you look at like what happened when it was released, and it's like the immediate debate around Mulan when it was released had very little to do with the film itself. It had much, much more to do with the fact that, it was shot in a region where they basically have these concentration camps for the Uyghurs.
Mm-hmm.
And, like, they thanked the local authorities for that. And if you look at the credits, you can see the details right there. And because it's on streaming, we can screen cap it and we can share it online.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like, if you're in the cinema and you're like, did I really see that? I'm not going to pay another $10 to watch it again to see that I did. And I kind of like, and the result of that being it releasing on streaming a week before it was supposed to release in China, the result being
Mm-hmm.
the Chinese government that they were trying to appease, is like, how you tried to like cover up all this stuff, and how you tried to downplay it. Somehow you managed to just turn up the boom. Here comes the
Right.
boom on the drop the boom on the horrible stuff that we're doing. And so I kind of, I find that kind of interesting in terms of Disney's relationship to China and the kind of streaming and the Mulan stuff.
Mm.
And that's my big worry with like Raya. And again, this is the thing, I guess we talked about it last week with Will. But like the way in which the pandemic works, and it does change the way that we watch movies, but it also
Mm.
changes the way that we talk about movies. And there's a lot of stuff that we talk about, and we talk about it very briefly, and it just vanishes. It's just gone. And
That's
it's
true.
it's just in the ether. And like, I joked about Hamilton earlier from like June last year, and it was inescapable. But now, it's just gone. There's nothing. And like part of me wonders, like with a movie like Raya, which is going to be dependent on things like word of mouth, which
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have the like frantic like foaming at the mouth fan base, doesn't necessarily have a strong social media presence. You're adding another barrier to entry for this.
Mm-hmm.
And is that going to make it harder for the film to break out and to generate buzz and to generate discussion if it turns out to be good? I don't know if it's going to be good. I'm hopeful based on, past performance, based on the people involved, and just because I like that kind of movie. But with that entrance fee there, with that barrier to entry, does it make it harder for people to talk about it? And as you said, like, will it end up being just a thing that never was because not enough people watched it, because not enough people paid to do it? Because obviously, like, again, the flip side of this is they're charging $29.99 for this, but we're in the middle of a global pandemic, and not everybody has $29.99 to throw around.
Mm-hmm.
And particularly like, sorry, yeah,
Especially given that, like, on the service that people are already paying for, you can watch a back catalog of cartoons and movies and all of the things that your kids will already enjoy. Though, like, and I, the other part of me though, in you bringing up this fact that like the idea that like we're not talking about Hamilton anymore, it even makes me think about something more recent, which is like season 2 of The Mandalorian,
yeah,
which to me was incredibly controversial, and I was ready to start internet fights about. Nobody's talking about it anymore.
yeah.
Nobody, no articles are being written. I was reading an interview with Jon Favreau where he was talking about the decision to bring Luke back. Spoilers, who cares anymore? Because no one's talking about it. And you know what? No comments beneath it. Not a ton of views on that article. Even for intellectual property in a controversial setting, no one cares anymore. It's very
Yeah,
strange.
and it's weird because like it's not just that like time passes and people stop talking, because you look at things before the pandemic and they're still usually controversial. Like if that article were talking about the rise of Skywalker or God forbid the Last Jedi, like I can guarantee you that comment section would not be quiet or calm. And those
Right.
views would probably be quite high as well. And it is interesting how the pandemic just operates as this kind of like cutoff. And I understand why. I think we talked about Will. It's limited bandwidth. It's limited
Yeah.
mental bandwidth, and understandably so. It's like as soon as something's done, I'm like, boop, It's out of my head. It's just
Yeah.
gone. It's just it's taking up valuable space where I could be worrying about the state of the world. So you're boom.
Well, I guess, like that's just it. It's not just the pandemic. It's elections over here. It's elections
Over
over in
there,
other parts
yeah,
of the
yeah.
country. It's what's happening here. What's happening? Like yes, you're absolutely right. Just the mental bandwidth to stay sane means we can't worry about bullshit like the
Well,
Mandalorian.
we can,
Yeah.
but we do it in like short-term memory and like random access. It's like we don't write it to long-term memory because that's for like fear, dread, and trauma.
Yeah.
That's for like the stuff that that our kids are going to be talking to counselors about like 30 years down the line. That's what gets written to long-term memory at the moment. Short-term memory is just like the Mandalorian. I had some strong thoughts on that.
Oh well, I guess it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of
He was
things.
a dude who wore a hat, right?
Yeah, long sigh, long sigh.
But yeah, no, I am looking forward to Raya and the Last Dragon. And actually, to bring it back to your point about Disney Plus and brand identity, it's worth noting, and particularly like the point that you made about like why would you pay if you're strapped for cash, you don't have $30 just lying around your account waiting to be splurged watching Raya the Last Dragon. You know, a couple of weeks before that, you're going to have this like star arriving on Disney Plus. You're going to have this streaming service that will just dump all of this Fox related content on there. And if you've seen the logo for Star, it's amazing. It's like just a reminder of how much of pop culture Disney own now. And it's like, yeah, why would you pay $30 to watch Raya and the Last Dragon when you could watch Buffy again with your teenagers, or you could watch Angel or 24 or Lost or The X-Files, or some of the Alien stuff if your kids are into that. I don't know, parenting. It's your choice. You know what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And so it seems like a very strange decision, and I think overall your cynicism is correct in that it's Disney calculating on a graph.
Yeah.
What can we get away with what kind of property? If this does better than Mulan, is it because it's animated or is it because it's an original IP? Well, then we need another point where we try an original IP that's not animated and an animated one that's a reboot, and then we'll just keep plotting because they keep finding the most efficient way to empty our wallets.
But it's also not even that. It's what's expendable and what's not, which is slightly concerning in terms of pop culture. It's like because like if they did that with The Mandalorian and it flopped, it would be like, okay, well our plans for Star Wars are scuppered for the next 4 years. If they do that with Black Widow and it flops, it's like, oh boy, we need to go back to the drawing board on this MCU thing. Whereas if they do it with Raya and the Last Dragon, it's like, who cares? Like, and I mean, I care. I very much care. But like in Disney, it's like, who cares really? It's like,
right. Raya and the Last Dragon isn't tied to a 10-year plan like Marvel is or like Star Wars is, because IP is the new gold.
Sorry, I somehow made that more cynical. I like that you were like, Darren, I think you're cynical and I think you're right. And I'm like, no. That's not even how cynical I am.
I'm way more right and way more cynical.
I think I'm that. Look,
that's great.
I mean, look, I'm looking forward to it. I'm actually like the cast is phenomenal. The trailer looks fun. I mean, again, it's got that kind of doofy Disney kind of like we're making fun jokes and there's bum references for the kids because kids love that stuff. I guess we've got a fantastic cast. It's got jokes. There's an adorable baby who's also a master criminal mastermind. I'm like, yeah, sure, I'm in with this. This seems like a fun
fantasy,
time.
It's action, it's fun. I am legitimately looking forward to it. And like I said, at the end of the day, for me, if we weren't in the pandemic, that is something I would take my family of 4 to, which would cost twice as much to see in a movie theater. So at the end of the day, it's still less money for me.
Yeah. And you can pause it, and you can make popcorn during it, and the treats that you buy will also be reasonably priced. And the jerk in front of you won't be on his phone, or if he is, you can send him to his room.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Take that, children. Take that. That's most like my wife. But all right. Let's move on now to something a little more, that we'll start cynical and move on to positive, because I really want to talk about it. One of my favorite shows at the moment is The Expanse. The Expanse is, for me, it's the good, hard sci-fi show right now. A very strange thing about The Expanse, something that I have noticed as I am a person of the internet. I am on the internet a lot. I see what the internet has to say. The Expanse is a show that is not talked about a lot, specifically when something that is talked about a lot is a lack of hard sci-fi shows. Like you see a lot of talk around Picard or Star Trek Discovery,
The
and like the
Mandalorian.
way well, that's fantasy
Yeah.
sci-fi ish. It gets wibbly,
Yeah.
but like there's a lot of people who say, oh well, Star Trek isn't the Star Trek that I like because I liked the hard sci-fi Star Trek, and now it's getting weird Star Trek. And I guess what I'm saying is there is a show called The Expanse that is all the hard sci-fi good story that you need, and it's right in front of your face. You're an Amazon Prime member already. We all are because you get shipping discounts. It's right there. You get to watch it all. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, again, I really like The Expanse, and again, I recently kind of binged it because it'd been on my list to do, and it's like, well, what else am I doing right now? I guess, like anybody else on the planet. And I'm really glad that I did. I think it's fantastic. We'll probably talk about why it's fantastic in a moment. One of the things that does strike me about it, and I think you're entirely right that it doesn't get the same buzz and the same kind of like attention and the same engagement that you see online. And again, this is one of the things where we're part of this ecosystem as well, and hey, we're talking about The Expanse right now, so we're solving the problem, listeners. But
get in on it.
But like, as somebody who does, like, you produce videos, I also do videos and I write and stuff like that, and you notice like you get led by where the audience wants you to go. So like one of the reasons why I write so much about Star Wars, I love Star Wars. That's part of the reason why I do it, but why I do it so frequently is because people engage with that and people like that. And that's fair. And like, you don't want to be the person who writes this article that you love, and I do write articles that I love, and there's just one comment down the bottom going, good article, thumbs up, and it's like, thank you thank you, one person who read
this.
The one person who read this. And I think actually the thing with The Expanse that is really interesting is, and again, you mentioned it's on Amazon Prime. The reason why it's on Amazon Prime is because it was on Sci-Fi. On Sci-Fi, it also underperformed to the degree that it couldn't attract a big enough audience on Sci-Fi, where the standards are, like, understandably relatively low, in order to keep going. So obviously they had to step in, and like, again, we'll come back to Amazon stepping in and buying The Expanse, because it's one of the great, why The Expanse is brilliant is because Jeff Bezos saving The Expanse is the perfect embodiment of why The Expanse is brilliant. But
Bezos personally just wanted to watch more, so he paid for it. Yes.
Yeah, and again, we'll come back to it in the sense of like Elon Musk loves Parasite. That's the kind of range of how brilliant this is. But with regards to The Expanse, and The Expanse, I think the issue is largely one of timing. Because you look at, there are times in the past where you pointed out that yes, there's the big intellectual property. So there's Star Trek. And, there's Star Wars. I know that that's technically science fantasy and whatever. And I know you could say there's Doctor Who as well. And Doctor Who is also arguably wibbly wobbly in the most literal sense.
I'd say Doctor Who is wholehearted fantasy. Let's not. It's fantasy with wires.
Yeah, with wires and paper mache and sets that wobble when Brian Blessed yells. But like, you have these big properties and they're attracting attention. They're sucking all the oxygen in the room. But you look at the past. And you look at, like, in the past, you had, for example, in the 90s, you had, say, Star Trek Deep Space Nine was on the same time as Babylon 5. And Babylon 5 was an original intellectual property from J. Michael Straczynski. And both of them, Star Trek Deep Space Nine far outperformed Babylon 5. But Babylon 5 was able to keep going and was able to attract a strong audience and able to be part of the cultural conversation. You jump forward 10 years and you have, Star Trek Enterprise on television on UPN, and you have Battlestar Galactica on Sci-Fi. And like, ironically enough, I would argue, while more people were definitely watching Enterprise on UPN because it came on before wrestling and everyone loves wrestling, you had, like, Battlestar Galactica was actually part of the cultural conversation. You would look at articles like The Guardian newspaper in England, which is a big deal. I don't know if it's a big deal in the States, but it's a big deal in this part of the world. But The Guardian described it as the best series to look at the war on terror on television right now. And it's like, yeah, it's like better than The Wire. That's what we're saying. Just so we're clear on this. Yes, The Guardian came out and said Battlestar Galactica is better than The Wire. But like, yeah, I know. But like, it was at that time you were able to have this show, and yes, Battlestar Galactica is a reimagined intellectual property, but it doesn't have the same brand recognition as Star Trek, Star Wars, Doctor Who, etc. Right?
Mhm.
Now we reach the current day and we're in peak television, and there are literally hundreds of scripted shows, and they are available not just on hundreds of television channels, they're also available on dozens of streaming services. And sometimes those streaming
Mhm.
services have subsidiaries that have their own specific channels that have their own specific TV shows, which make these shows impossible to find. And what you
Yes.
have is you have a situation, which is what you alluded to there, which is the conversation gravitates towards the thing that you recognize. So instead of going online, instead of looking for what is good science fiction, because I like science fiction, you go, I like Star Trek. I'll watch the new Star Trek. And, again, let's not get into the new Star Trek discussion. That's a separate conversation of itself. But let's just say that, there's a good chance if you liked 90s Star Trek, new Star Trek may not be entirely for you. In the same way that if you liked 60s Star Trek, 90s Star Trek may not have been entirely for you, to be clear. That sort of thing.
Yes.
Or if you liked,
I think that's a fair statement.
yeah, that's a fair statement. And I think that if you would be much happier, ironically, and I think a lot of people on the internet would be much happier, if instead of fixating on how 2020 Star Trek is not for them, they instead said, what's the good science fiction show that's on, and watch The Expanse instead. But because The Expanse is only tied to a series of books, and those books do not have, say, the cultural appeal of something like, say, the Lord of the Rings franchise, they
Right.
don't have the same market. So it ends up being this little curio, this curiosity, this footnote, which is disheartening in this age of so much media content.
Cat's trying to come in.
Oh.
Not the dog, the cat.
The cat. Have we met the cat?
Get out of here.
What's the cat's name?
The cat's name is Biscuit.
Hey, Biscuit.
Almost as big as the dog, and able to open my door as well. So
Fantastic.
Anyway.
Opposable thumbs.
no, like a velociraptor. No, I think that's like a really good point. And like the books that the show is based off of, I have not read them. The reason we started watching the show, my wife and I are big sci-fi fans, is she was reading the books. Leviathan Wakes, I think, is the first book, or is that the new one?
I was going to say, I think Leviathan Wakes is the last one in the series. It's the
is it the
ninth one, I
last one?
think. He says, having
Lordy.
not done any research
No,
on this
any
whatsoever.
sort of sci-fi credit that I have is now gone.
Because, I mean, it's The Ashes of Babylon is one of the more recent ones as well. There's Abaddon's Gate is the third one. There's,
Yes.
Caliban's War is the second one.
Cibola Burn. Oh, there's so many of them.
Yeah.
Well, and I guess so the reason we started watching the show on the Sci-Fi Channel is because my wife was such a fan of the books, and so we started watching on the Sci-Fi Channel. And I'll tell you what, I was skeptical at first because it is a sci-fi original. At least the first 3 seasons is a sci-fi original. It doesn't have a big budget.
Yeah.
It doesn't always look the best. The actors aren't particularly good. I don't want to I don't want to mince words, because obviously they're shooting on a small budget. You don't get a ton of time to prepare and extra takes. The cast isn't great. The characters themselves are very standard. I know, I'm telling you, this is a show I enjoy.
Watch this show with these passable actors and these out of the box characters.
And the effects aren't always great, but you know what? The effects are good enough. And the real thing is the story. It's like the world that they inhabit and the story that they tell is so engaging throughout. And the attention to hard sci-fi detail. Like, there is a lot of attention paid to their magnetic boots when they're in their spaceships, to how they eat and drink, just like astronauts would have to eat and drink in their space platforms. It's really, really commendable, their attention to detail for those hard sci-fi elements that make it an engaging world. And they do such a good job of that.
Yeah. I should apologize. You were right. It was Leviathan Wakes is the first book, and Leviathan Falls is the last book, which is why we got confused. So
there we
apologies.
go.
I owe you a sincere apology for that. But what I will say is, I think you're entirely right with regards to the hard sci-fi and the attention to detail and the sense of scale and distance, which it covers remarkably well. Because again, loose spoilers for the film, for the TV show, but most of it takes place within the solar system, at least within the first 2 books, which are the first 2.5 seasons. And it's Earth, it's Mars, and it's the asteroid belt, and then it's beyond maybe to Jupiter at a push. but you get a real sense of how large space is, as the title implies, the expanse. And like that's reflected in little details like the camera movement. Repeatedly throughout the show, they do these wonderful establishing shots that I love, where they'll zoom in on something and then they'll zoom out to give you a sense of how hard it is to find that against like the black background of space. Or they'll kind of like zoom in. Again, it's very much like, it feels like a logical and organic development from, if you remember Battlestar Galactica. Remember the innovation of like Battlestar Galactica's CGI, where it was like there was a tiny CGI cameraman focusing the camera, which I love.
Yes.
Like it was like, wait, I gotta get it in shot.
The digital, like the fake camera quirks that Battlestar Galactica invented, like the digital quirks to make it look like they had a real camera. Yes.
Yeah, and like that's what's up, and it feels like an extension of that, where it's like, oh, hold on, we got it in shot. No, we lost it. Wait, there it is. Yes, there it is. We got it. But I mean, even things like how precious water is, for example, the details of like how long it takes for not just people to travel in the world, but signal to travel in the world. Like, there's a really great sequence, and again, loose spoilers in the broadest sense of the term, but like there's a sequence where there is a war at one point in the show, and the two command centers, which are on different planets, are like waiting 20 minutes to find out if the shot that they fired actually hit what they wanted it to.
Yes.
It's so beautiful, and it's so clever, and it's so fantastic, and so committed to what it's doing, and it's all, and again, this is the thing with really good science fiction, it is all in service of the theme of the work. Like, I would argue that like The Expanse is the science fiction show of the now, Darren says, hoping that at some point it will end up on a pull quote somewhere. But no, I think it very much, it's the big science fiction show of the moment. It's the science fiction show that reflects the current time. And like, you go back and you look at, you could say like, you know, Star Trek represented like the late 60s, Star Wars gave us the 70s and the 80s, in the 90s it was the 90s Star Trek shows, in the 2000s it was Battlestar Galactica. And, you know, all those things reflected particular anxieties of the moment. Like in Star Trek, it was like, oh my god, the universe is crazy. We're all going to die and everybody's already dead. You know, in like Star Wars, it's like, well, I mean, sure, things are crazy and the Emperor's insane, but let's work through our dad issues first. And then you get to like the 90s, it's like, oh wow, Cold War's over. America's won. I guess that there's nothing but utopian futures ahead of us. And then you get to 2000, it's like, oh my god, this war on terror thing, it's really intense, isn't it? It's like, yeah, we might have to like torture some dudes and like throw them in airlocks and like not trust each other at all. It's like, wow, okay, this is very intense. And you get to The Expanse, and The Expanse is like, and this is why it's brilliant, is that it is a very much a post-2008 recession show. It's a show that is about like the world as we live in it today, extrapolated into the future. Like, you have this like recurring motif of how difficult it is, how precious air is, how much they charge people for air, how much they charge people for water, how much like corporations are allowed to get away with, because it just so happens that they just control stuff anyway. So what does it matter? What's the point in even trying to like get involved or to stop this from happening? And
absolutely,
and like that's
the exploitation of labor, the bureaucracy of government, the small things that set off giant catastrophes. No, all sorts of very, very now topics.
I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, again and again, like Game of Thrones, not to bring that into the conversation separately, because that's the cliche thing. Oh, The Expanse is Game of Thrones, but in space.
That's how they sold it. Absolutely.
That's Darren like, going for his second pull quote. I want the cover of The Expanse to be like just Darren talks about.
That's how the Sci-Fi Channel advertised it. If you like Game of Thrones, it's in space.
But, like, looking past that, and obviously there are reasons for that, because I think that, like, as a Ty, Frank used to work as George R.R. Martin's assistant, and George R.R. Martin very generously gave very generous, like, pull quotes to it as well. It's like, it's not as if that, like, came out of nowhere and was conjured into thin air, but, like, the structuring of the show, where we mentioned the fact that it takes place on 3 different planets or 3 different regions, and, like, as the show goes on, it gets bigger and vaster, and it does that Game of Thrones thing where the cast separate, but it also does that Game of Thrones thing where there is an existential threat to humanity, and it's established in literally the opening scene of the first episode. It's like, oh my god, our understanding of the universe and the laws that govern the universe is wrong. We're all terribly screwed. It's going to be awful when this problem, which is out there, arrives here on Earth. You know what will be really terrible? If we couldn't put our differences aside and just got stuck on really petty squabbling about things that don't really matter whatsoever. And so, you know, we weren't in any way prepared for the horrible stuff that happened. And again, that's I think what makes it another thing that makes it a science fiction show for the moment, because it's like, yeah, things like climate change and income inequality are actually happening. Things like migrant crises are spreading across the world as a result of climate change. And instead of like fixing these problems, or instead of even acknowledging these problems, we're like, no, culture war first, just so we're clear. Let's find what's important here.
Right.
And like,
yeah.
and the Expanse really does that, and it does that really cleverly, and it does it really funly. And actually, just to double down on your, because I've been really nice and really generous to it, and I think deservedly so. It's fantastic. I'm not worth your time, but to double down on your original criticism of it, like, it's not even just like, I would argue the problem is that it's not just the actors and the lead characters. It's the lead characters are arguably the least interesting part of the Expanse. Like, the central crew of the Rossi are like the part of the show that I'm like, I feel like if you didn't need them logistically to tie like these things together like a needle and thread, if you could find a way to just like cut that and still have the show work, I would be like, this would be like,
no, like it's basically their job just to like move you, the audience, from one part of the world to the next, so you can take in what's really happening. Like, and which is why it's like they're standard characters. They do stock action hero things, and that's fine because they get you to the next scene, which gives you the world.
Well, I mean, the famous observation is that it was designed by the writers as an RPG setting.
That's right.
And I suspect that's a large part of why the central characters feel a lot like a generic like RPG like team. It's like, okay, we got the bruiser. He's got anger issues. He's a sociopath. Have we got an engineer? We need a pilot. Let's get a pilot.
All right, generic fighter. Who's playing medic? Anyone? No one's playing medic. Okay, all right.
We'll write him out. The medic's out. The medic's out in the first season. He's gone. He's done.
That's true. I think he did actually. I think he did die the first season. But no, it's a beautiful world, and all these things that we talk about, the things that the Expanse touches upon, it doesn't just acknowledge them and move on like so many works of fiction do. Like, oh yes, income equality is a thing in this, but we're not going to deal with that. It's about a romance. Like, the Expanse actually dives into real issues like any good sci-fi fantasy thing does. That's it's monster as metaphor, which is a big thing for me, but it deals with it. And that to me is what steps it even more over the line as far as like, it's spaceships fighting. That's awesome. It's like neat sci-fi tech things. It's interesting problem solving, but it's also about something. It's so nice. It's what a nice show.
And it's also very clearly structured as well. Again, that the sense that not only does it imitate Game of Thrones, it's learned from Game of Thrones. Where like the big issue with Game of Thrones is that it just kept going outwards and outwards, and it was just this splurge, and it was like, oh, now Arya's on a different continent. I guess we're going to have to keep checking in with her. And it's like, how are we going to bring all these characters together? The final season of Game of Thrones really has a lot of logistical work just to get the characters into the places they need to be. Boy, I really wouldn't want to be writing that. You read Game of Thrones, it's like, I can see why George R.R. Martin has taken so freaking long to get everything streamlined, because he's let it...
He just doesn't want to,
he's let it grow so large that there's no way to do it without taking a chainsaw to it. And he's not going to do that, because the show did it, and it didn't really work. It didn't entirely work. Like, I'm more generous towards the final season of Game of Thrones than most, because my reading of it is very much like, if it was easy, George R.R. Martin would have done it by now. That's my reading. It's like, you have characters, you have actors who are only going to be around for so long, you have actors who are already aging out, you have writers who are aging out, you have a production team in Belfast that are like exhausted. Like, if you talk to any of those people, they love the work that they do, but asking them to do even one more year of that is like tantamount to cruelty. Like, I mean, I'd say I live in Ireland. It's okay. I could say this about like living and working in Ireland, but I mean, like, you meet these people and they're exhausted and they're drained. And so like, I understand. I accept that the final season of Game of Thrones has problems and issues and very serious problems, and a number of very serious problems that were easily avoidable in terms of plotting and structuring. But I also accept that like, any attempt to resolve that was going to be a problem, because by the time they reach the end of Martin's work, there's no way to trim that hedge. That hedge is the house now at this point, and there's no way to get it to work. And what I admire about the Expanse is the Expanse tidies away after itself as it goes. So like, it'll spend a season or it'll spend the equivalent of a book on a particular theme or subject, and it'll then just put them in a box and it's like, okay, we're done with that. That goes on the shelf. That's maybe it's there for later if we need it, but we're not going to keep checking in on it.
It's a reference now.
Yeah.
Like, oh yes, we took care of that. Everything's tied up. We can look at it and reference it as we move forward. Absolutely.
Yeah. Because it's like again, then there's the seasons are what 10 to 13 episodes. So it's I think the first book takes up a season and a half. The second book takes up like the second half of the second season and the first half of the third season, and then the third book is crammed into the end of the third season. And it's like all of these are distinct narrative entities. Like they clearly end. They reach an end point, and at that end point, everything but like the core essential themes of the show, the core characters, and sometimes even the core characters, like there are points at which like recurring characters or major characters disappear for a year because there's no point in just checking in with them as they sit at a desk reading a book. And I kind of like, I really admire that in terms of its storytelling. I think it is very, very well constructed. It's worth singling out, actually. I think it's Naren Shakar, who, again, we talked about like the influence of Star Trek and like 90s Star Trek and the connection between 90s Star Trek and this. It's notable that like Battlestar Galactica in 2004 was Ronald D. Moore, who was a product of Star Trek The Next Generation and Star Trek Deep Space Nine. And very briefly Star Trek Voyager, but that's an interesting story for another time. And then you have Naren Shakar, who was, again, another writer. He came up. He was one of the 4 young kind of like interns on Next Generation with Moore.
Oh, okay.
And he came up through that. Now, he spent some time in CSI. He spent some time in Law and Order. But he's now showrunning The Expanse. And you're like, yeah, this is kind of amazing. You can see the connection, like, historically back to the Next Generation, back to Star Trek, back to 90s sci-fi, and I really admire that in the show. And like we've been harsh on the cast, I will single out like the Expanse has really, really, really good supporting casting. I think that like stuff like,
and I don't want to be mean to them. Like I've been on sets, and you know what? The more time you have to really like embody your lines, the more time you have for takes, the better the performance. They have a tight schedule because it's not a very expensive show. And throughout the years, they have gotten significantly and noticeably more comfortable in their characters. The first season's rough. It's a sci-fi original.
Yeah. And I mean, like, but like you look at the guest cast, and the guest cast includes like Chet L. Coleman from The Wire. At one point, David Strathairn, like who's going to be Oscar nominated for his work in Nomadland this year, who was in Good Night and Good Luck, shows up with a Creole accent and a horseshoe mustache as a space pirate. And I'm like, I thought I loved this show, but now I love this show. Like you have like Jared Harris is in there. Yeah.
Thomas Jane is in there, just effortlessly getting through every scene. Yeah. Who's the head of the UN?
Christian.
What's her name?
So that's Sharia Agdashlu, and I apologize for mangling that. But Oscar-nominated actor Sharia Agdashlu.
Beautiful performances. Yes. The side characters are great. A lot of the cast is good. The main cast finds it eventually. Like, but it's an understandable byproduct of being a sci-fi original, and which is kind of like the broader point here, which is why I understand kind of the stigma that The Expanse has. Sharknado is a sci-fi original. You know, like. Being a sci-fi original has a certain label put on your show. I am very happy that Bezos apparently was a fan, so we got more of it because I was such a fan. I think you bring up such an interesting point, though, about its connections to Star Trek, because I think, like, now that you've said that, I'm putting together that it actually is the best of both worlds, in that it gives us a season-long narrative, but it's also very episodic. Yeah. Like each little episode is very self-contained while also giving us a broader goal that they're working towards, and you can kind of see them hopping back and forth across that line. I really, yes, what a lovely observation.
I mean, it's that Michael Piller approach where every little episode has to tell you something about a character. It does, and again, like it works really well because there are stretches where certain characters are around, and they're around because you need to bring them to Toronto in order to shoot the season of the show, but you don't have anything for them to do yet. So it's like, okay, we're going to give them some solid character work. And I'm thinking actually again of like in the start of the 5th season, you have the stuff involving Christian at the UN, where her job is literally just to spin wheels for 3 episodes of the 5th season so that when stuff happens, she's like, boom, I was always here. And like kind of like, but even in those 3 episodes though, she has small little character arcs. She has small little moments. She has things to do with her husband and with her daughter that serve to illuminate her character and serve the larger plot while being self-contained of themselves. I think it's remarkable. Just to bring it back to Jeff Bezos, I kind of like the thing that I find amazing about like Jeff Bezos saving the Expanse, and actually like not only just saving the Expanse, like did you hear the story about this? He was at like the National Space Society international conference, and he'd heard that the Expanse was cancelled, and he was like, oh well, the Expanse cast are here doing some stuff, and it'd be really great if like tomorrow night when I'm doing my big centerpiece speech, because Jeff Bezos is big on space, and we'll go back to that in a moment, it'd be really great if I could just like announce to the audience with the cast in it that I'd saved their show. And apparently everybody like Amazon spent the next day just making phone calls to make it happen, which I kind of adore. So Jeff Bezos.
How big of a check do you need? Absolutely, that's no problem.
We'll courier it over to you right now. We'll deliver it to you via Amazon. Have you seen Amazon Prime? You can get it there tomorrow. Next day delivery, baby. But like, and I love that like the Expanse itself became a next day delivery for Jeff Bezos. But one of the things I find really interesting about it is that like Bezos is. For anybody who is not familiar with Bezos outside of the fact that, his penis appeared in newspapers, and do you not remember that? The famous, somebody tried to blackmail him with dick pics, and his response was to release them to the public, which is a great power move, as you do. But he's also the owner of Amazon, and also highly questionable in that regard as well, based on their working practices and the fact that he has made all of the money by exploiting all of the workers during the pandemic. Like this weird jockeying thing that happened, I think, last week, where it's like, Elon Musk is the richest man in the world. Oh no, Jeff Bezos is again. It's like, people are struggling to feed their families. I feel like you could maybe just like tax them just a little bit,
just a little. And I think actually Bezos has said, yeah, it's okay to tax me.
I love that. It's like, come at me, bro. But like,
well, no, like he doesn't. He has so much money, but like you're incredibly correct. Like the weird irony of Jeff Bezos being a fan of The Expanse when one of the big overarching themes is the exploitation of labor.
Yeah. Yes. And I mean, not only that, but like Bezos is a big space fan. So if you don't know this, like Bezos is like most it's again separate conversation about why billionaires are obsessed with space. But like you look at people like say Elon Musk, for example, and you look at people like Bezos, and they're all obsessed with getting into space. And Bezos has this big plan for taking mankind to the stars. And like the thing watching The Expanse is that what you mentioned there, which is like The Expanse is exactly what it would look like if the guy who brought you Amazon, like as a viable business model, decided that mankind was going to space. Like if he rolled out spaceflight, it would look just like The Expanse. And it's really weird to me that Bezos watches this and doesn't go, I think they're a bit harsh on that there. I think that, they're being a bit unfair on like the Royal Scientific Charter. I think those guys are just doing their jobs. They're just bringing jobs to the frontier.
Listen, those belters are lucky to have a job. We keep sending them food. How lucky are they? Those belters are complaining
do they
a lot.
have any idea how much it costs to ship air? I mean, come on. Really? Maybe if a couple of them like suffocated, they'd learn a lesson. I don't know. I mean, what are they gonna do? Unionize? I mean, come on. Like unionizing is actually a major plot point in the first season, and you look at things like Amazon's efforts to break up unions, and it reminds me a lot of remember last year, and again remember the before times, but remember the Academy Award campaign for Parasite. And Parasite, if you haven't seen it, is well worth your time. I imagine most people listening to the podcast have seen it. If you haven't, it is very worth your time, worth seeking out. But it is, to put it bluntly, a movie about not just eating the rich, but like filleting them, and just like seasoning them and turning them every once in a while so the flavor kind of steers in. It is not a kind of a happy movie. It's a very explicitly a class movie and very explicitly a movie about how terrible exploitation is.
Hmm.
And Elon Musk loves it. It was Elon Musk's favorite movie of like 2019. And I'm like, did you watch it? Did you pick up on the themes of it? Who were you rooting for, Elon? I want to know. I want to know which character you were rooting for when you watched it.
I feel like in order to get to the places that they have gotten to, like, Elon Musk, who always talks about how hard he has ever worked and never once mentions that his father
That
owned an
died.
emerald
Yeah.
mine. Like, I think he has already disassociated so much of himself from his own life where he can no longer see things like that. So he's just a meme lord at this point. It's like, this is the movie people are talking about.
But yeah, like Bezos saving the Expanse is fascinating because, yeah, as you point out, so much of it is around things like labor organizing and things like exploitation and things like, the necessary expanse of capitalism and the horrible grinding of the human soul beneath those wheels. And it's like, does Bezos watch this and think it's a story of like the triumph of the human spirit? It's like Bezos, like, yeah, finally, capitalism is getting into space.
He's, he watches it and he goes, "Oh, spaceship goes pew pew sometimes. I
Fair,
like that."
fair.
Yeah.
He's a big.
And then some people are in Iraq. They're complaining about something. I don't pay attention to that part.
No, he's obviously rooting for like the Bern Gorman character. And again, I think we talked about it when we talked about like Enola Holmes. You really want Bern Gorman to play like a romantic lead at some point, where it's just like a happy, cheerful, happy-go-lucky guy. But no, he plays a security chief on a mining expedition or scientific research expedition, and he has to deal with these pesky belters who have set up a little colony there, so he can't just take all the lithium and go home and make himself a millionaire. And it goes exactly as you would expect that plotline to go. And I love it. And again, I love that, like, again, the casting is so good because Gorman is still a gettable actor. He's an actor who you recognize. I think one of my colleagues describes him, and I'm not entirely sure this is complimentary, as melted Spock is kind of his description of Bern Gorman.
All right,
Yeah,
that's fair.
And but he's great. He's great in absolutely everything that he's in. Like going back
Fantastic,
to like Torchwood, The Dark Knight Rises, going to things like say Game of Thrones, and even like Enola Holmes. He knows what he's doing. It's great because you watch him in interviews and he seems like a very happy man, and you're like, well, okay, that's good.
Yeah, no, he's got work. He's has his niche and he's happy to be in there. Good for him. He gets to have some fun. I can only imagine it's very fun to be the obvious bad guy.
Yeah. I mean, and I love that when they have the moment where they give him like the big self-justifying speech. Like even then he's the asshole. Like it's a moment where like he's like, what? Am I supposed to apologize for like trying to secure the lithium mining rights? Is it my fault that these people and their children showed up and got in my way? It's like it's like I could see your thought process visualized on screen, but yes, you are the asshole here. With the idea of him just typing away on Reddit, being like, "Am I the asshole? Shot a dude called me a name. I shot him in the head. Am I an asshole?
Come on, he called me a name. He called me, I gotta stay. I gotta keep my leadership status. He called me a name. Come on. No, I think like really like I'm so happy that one, you enjoyed it because I know you and I have similar leanings towards sci-fi, Star Trek, and Doctor Who, and all that fun stuff. And I think if you are looking for something to binge, there are now. Are they on season 6?
No, season 5. The problem again, this is where it gets slightly controversial. So season 5 will be ending as this is released. So this is released over the weekend. The final episode will be released in the middle of the week on Wednesday, I think, in the UK.
Right.
Possibly on Tuesday in the US. I'm not entirely sure of how time works.
I believe it's Wednesday for us.
Perfect, cool. And then they've announced there's going to be a 6th season, but they've announced the 6th season is going to be the last, which is heartbreaking because there are 9 books. Now there is some speculation that because the books, and again, this is one of those differences between Game of Thrones and The Expanse, where Game of Thrones, George R.R. Martin was like, it's going to be 3 books. And he was like, no, what if the first book was 3 books? And it's like, okay, but in order to get to the ending, I need to have a gap. So I can have like 5 years where I can just make up what I need to happen so the characters can just like line up to the finale. And then he was like, no, I don't want to do that. I didn't want to write what was in those 5 years. Like, George, you're never going to finish this. And I like that The Expanse is like, no. We've watched George. And like, whatever works for him. We're very happy. He's clearly made a lot of money and he's living his dream, and that's very good for him. But we are going to have a time jump. So there's a 28-year, I believe, time jump between the 6th and 7th books in the series. So they've announced that Amazon have announced, despite having all the money in the world, and apparently despite the fact that Bezos is a fan of this, which you imagine would protect it in some way, but they've said,
Yeah.
no, we're going to wrap it up after 6 seasons, after the finishing of the 6 books. And there's some speculation that what they might do is they might have a spin-off after the time jump. So they might recast the roles instead of doing stuff like, I don't know, CGI aging or kind of like latex prosthetics for 28-year-older versions of these characters. So it will actually be ending next season. Will be the final season, which is a shame.
And you know, it's a shame, but I like it. I want that to happen. I want you to have a plan for the end of your show, and I would much rather have 6 solid seasons than, you know, like 6 solid seasons and then one very questionable one and then one that lights the internet on fire. So
what are you possibly referring to there, Jack? I can't imagine what you're referring to. Yeah,
Seinfeld.
Every show ever, basically. Because again, like, this is the thing about old network television, was your ratings had to be bad for you to be cancelled. So it's like, no show ever really gets cancelled at its peak, because if it's at its peak, the option is renew it. Like, offer the cast and crew more money, so get them to make more, even if they're tired and exhausted. So then the quality dips, and then you cancel it. So it's like, boom, sharp drop in quality.
No, so they're making that call. They're saying, hey, we're going to end it. We're going to work towards ending it. I think that's the correct call. I guess all I'm saying is watch it.
Yeah.
It's so good. And if you enjoyed 90s Star Trek, if you enjoyed Star Trek The Next Generation, there is so much, like, it's a perfect mixture of Next Gen and Battlestar Galactica.
Yeah.
Or, you know, the remake of Battlestar Galactica, at least, where it's like, it's a lot of like lofty ideals and moralizations and like sticking to your moral guns for specific reasons. You know, it's very Picard, but like wrapped in the dirt of the Edward James Olmos Battlestar Galactica. That's exactly what it is. So if you're a fan of either of those, The Expanse is for you, man.
Yeah, science fiction show of the era. And one of the shows of the era. Like, again, I kind of want to go back and rewatch it before I actually say that and commit to it. Because I did what you do when you binge it, which is just like where you absorb it into your brain. And I'm not entirely sure that I can like firmly delineate between like nightmares that I had and the show that I watched at certain points. But I do kind of want to go back and kind of process it at my own rate. And I probably will before the final season. But yeah, it's phenomenal. It's really, really good. And, you know, we've been harsh on the main cast. They're generally fine. But like the supporting cast is amazing and outstanding. And
you know what? Even as you get into later in season 1 and specifically season 2 and beyond, the cast has found their voice. Yeah. You know, they have found the character's voice. The first couple of episodes are a little rough, but you know what? So was the first 2 seasons of Next Gen. So come on, get over it.
I mean, there's no episode where any character gets stuck by a kind of like a magic tendril and remembers events from the previous 2 seasons.
All right. Well, we have to wrap up. We are at time, but thank you everyone for watching and or listening to this. I'm just really happy that we got to like be uber positive about something, even though, you know, obviously critical, but it's like, I know we're critics. And so a lot of times we are harshly critical on things that we talk about. So here's a chance for us just to be positive about something. Thank you all for watching and or listening to this. Once again, I've been Jack Packer.
I've been Darren Mooney.
And bye.
Cheers. Really enjoyed that. Actually really enjoyed being positive about stuff.
Right?